And no sooner had Terry started going over the scenes when the door flung open and he runs through screaming with the electrodes streaming behind him. He ran back to his room, refused to come out for 3 days. We thought, oh boy, we're interns at the time. So we thought we are in a whole lot of trouble here. They're going to run us out of the program. We messed this guy up. We now call that re-traumatization. We didn't have a word for it then. And so we coaxed him back after about 4 days to try again. But we looked at the research, there wasn't much on it, but we found something called self-control desensitization. So we put him in charge. We tape recorded the scenes, and then he had a button in which he could start or stop depending on what he could tolerate. Well, this works like a charm. So within a week or two, there was what we call desensitization and actually reprocessing those horrible memories that he had buried.
Hey guys, and welcome. I am Morgan Giss McDonald, founder, CEO of Paper Raven Books, and I have with us today a special author who is launching his brand new book, which is called Psychology Confidential. A crazy professor tells almost all the adventures and misadventures of his life in psychology. Dr. John Martin, I am so excited to have you here with us today.
It's so nice to be here. Thank you, Morgan.
Yes. Well, this is amazing because you are launching a book, and I almost hesitate to call it a book because so much is packed inside of this book. I mean, you had an entire career in academia as a professor, as a clinical psychologist, as a researcher. You also have a lot of your own sort of musings and stories about psychology sort of within the ivory tower and just a normal life. Can you kind of give us a little insight into like, why did you decide that the world was ready for something like Psychology Confidential? What do you hope to share with people?
Well, as you know, I'm a storyteller, so I have lots of stories in there. And as I sort of went through my career as a teacher and researcher and therapist, I would find myself telling these stories to friends, say on bike rides or sitting down for coffee or having a beer together. And sometimes they would say, those are great stories. You should, I had one particular person tell me, you should put those in a book. And, I began thinking, yeah, that might be fun. But some of the experiences I've had, let's just say I had to be past my career in order to be able to tell them truthfully and not get in trouble with, say, the administrations and the schools or some of the folks that maybe I had some fun with. And so it was when I came to being my second retirement from university, med school, that I came to a place of actually being burned out. I was sort of done with my teaching and research career for the most part. I had friends too telling me, it's about time you left there. You're so burned out. And so then it became a what now? What do I do now? And just the idea that I could write in a different way, not like research articles and grants and the kinds of things that I did as an academic, something that was more personal and perhaps to put together a lot of these funny stories, I thought, and then some stories that had to do with my work with veterans, with the area of trauma and PTSD, some of my own experiences in those areas too. And then I was one of those crazy academic atheist professors who worshiped at the altar of science, who had a radical experience with God. And I wanted to tell that too, but not to make it a religious book. And so all that came together, and I drafted it for years. Oh, this and that, and I struggled with how am I going to write? It's a different kind of writing. And of course, seat in the pants, pants in the seat, I mean, that was a hard thing to do. And then I found you guys. I found Paper Raven Books. And that sort of was the breakthrough for me. To work with all of your professional editors and you made a huge difference. Anyway, sorry, we'll have to cut that out.
Totally fine.
Oh. I should have turned this stupid thing off. All right. There we go. So ultimately, I guess I'm now an author. We're at the finish line, and this is the first, uh, um, mostly nonfiction. It's got fiction in there, a book that I want to see if other people would be interested in my stories.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what I love about your stories is we've talked about this kind of from the beginning when you and I first met, was that you didn't
Mhm.
want to write a book for academics. You didn't want to write
No,
any more journal
no,
articles and things like that about
no,
psychology.
no.
It was more the fun, sort of tongue in cheek. And
Yeah,
we can see the book kind of over
yep,
your shoulder, but you wanted to bring more of an element of lighthearted, almost poking
yep,
fun
yep,
at
yep,
psychology. And I
yep.
think you've really done that. And of course, there's a lot of, self-deprecating humor in there as well. You're not just
Sure.
poking fun at others.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
that's something that I really want to emphasize for anyone who's like, I'm interested in psychology and I'd like to know more about what a professor would have to say over his entire, career and research and all of that, is that these are really they're fun stories that have a point
Mhm.
too, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so you have kind of like a breadth of stories. Some of them are a little bit more on the serious side, and we can talk more about them. Like you've done research with veterans or children who, have some sort of either, disability or disadvantage
Yeah,
in learning
right,
or
right.
communication, but also like animal psychology and funny stories about your family or your
Mhm.
students and things like that. And so maybe I'd love to give a little bit of a range. And folks, if you're watching with us and you're curious, you can actually grab a free copy today. If you go to paperravenbooks.com/psychology confidential, it'll take you straight to Amazon. You can grab a free copy today, and you can dive in whenever you're ready to read the whole book. But we want to give a little sample of kind of what they might get. Can you give us like either one of your favorite stories around maybe the veteran research? I mean, you were cutting edge. You were one of the very first people who did studies and research around PTSD. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like and what happened?
Yeah, this is an interesting story. In fact, I just was talking with my colleague Terry Keene, who's at the Boston VA, who was my co-conspirator, you might say. We're on internship at a major consortium between a med school and a VA, and this was late '70s, shall we say? This was a while ago, and a this amazing veteran, a Marine, was dropped into our lab with what looked like multiple phobias. He had so much fear. He was a guy who had ended up being diagnosed as schizophrenic. He had drug issues. He beat up a whole bar full of people, including a sheriff, because somebody came up behind him and tapped him on the shoulder. Now, we know now, boy, this is one of the symptoms of PTSD. But at the time, we didn't have a name for it. That was around the time we began noticing this in Vietnam vets, where it sort of would incubate, and then all of a sudden they would decompensate. So the early word for it was the delayed Vietnam stress syndrome. And this wonderful Marine was so hypersensitized and so fearful, and he couldn't watch war movies, of course, anything that had a helicopter sound in it, or if a helicopter came overhead, he would freak out. So we actually set up a kind of a desensitization treatment for him. And Terry was in the chamber with him. We had him hooked up to all the electrodes to monitor his physiological responses, including muscle tension, heart rate, blood pressure, GSR, things like that. And I'm on the outside of the chamber, monitoring the physiograph, which we call a polygraph as well. And as soon as Terry started the scenes, to take him back through some of the scenes, one of them was in which he observed somebody on patrol, his point man have his head blown off. And so that started the trauma for him. And no sooner had Terry started going over the scenes, when the door flung open and he runs through screaming with the electrodes streaming behind him. He ran back to his room, refused to come out for 3 days. We thought, oh boy, we're interns at the time. So we thought, we are in a whole lot of trouble here. They're going to run us out of the program. We messed this guy up. We now call that re-traumatization. We didn't have a word for it then. And so we coaxed him back after about 4 days to try again. But we looked at the research, there wasn't much on it, but we found something called self-control desensitization. So we put him in charge. We tape recorded the scenes, and then he had a button in which he could start or stop depending on what he could tolerate. Well, this works like a charm. So within a week or two, there was what we call desensitization, and actually reprocessing those horrible memories that he had buried that were so traumatic for him. And this guy was maybe as close as we can call something a cure. And so I remember after that, his life came together, got his job back. I think they purged his record. He got his family back. He got a good job. He stopped drinking and using drugs in order to numb himself out. And I remember he would see me in the hallway walking through the medical center, and he would yell, "Dr. Martin." He would run up and give me this bone-crushing hug. It grabbed me. And since then, while that was not my major field, which was behavioral medicine, I always had a kind of a heart pull for that. And more in the last 10 years, I've worked more through the VA with veterans with PTSD, and I now am doing teletherapy with them as well, and using some of the more modern treatments we have that really work well for them.
Oh, that's amazing. It's stories like this that it feels so much more human and approachable when you tell the story from your own experience. Like we could read about the studies and the research and things like that, but it's so much more powerful to have that story behind it, and the bone crushing hug, and and it feels more powerful to us, to
It was
the stories. So,
and what was so interesting for me was, as I talk about in the book, was that I had PTSD as well, which I didn't know from childhood, kind of a different war zone, if you will. And so I go into some detail in the book about that, but I also got my wonderful service dog, Barnabas, whose original name was Bello. And he's still with me now. He's 9. And I have stories about him that are just wonderful, of how he helped me and how he's helped other veterans. For example, one veteran, this actually wasn't a veteran. This was a person who had very strong type A anger control issues, called himself a type A plus plus plus. And he wasn't interested in having my dog in there in the session. And normally Barnabas would go over and greet them and lay over their feet and just be a calming influence, but he wanted no part of him. But within a few days of sessions, they sort of made peace. And it's hard not to love my wonderful black lab, Barnabas. As it turns out, he began thinking, maybe I could have a service dog too. He had diabetes, a fairly brittle form of diabetes. And so next thing I know, he's exploring. He gets himself a Labradoodle, and trains him up as a sugar sniffer, we say. And then he would bring the dog in after some time, and the dogs would greet each other, and they were all happy, sort of service dog to service dog. They didn't do the slap me 5. I guess that would be 4 because dogs only have 4. And it just and actually that dog had helped him in some ways. He at one point his sugar levels were so low he was going into a coma, and the dog alerted and got help.
Wow.
So those sorts of things happened, and I've used Barnabas a lot with my work with veterans and with me. He actually has been such a source of help and comfort to me as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, certainly, you talk about your own journey within psychology, not just how has psychology influenced the way that I see other people, but really there's a lot of internal reflection that goes on here. And one of the things I think was really important and powerful about your journey is, and you mentioned it, when we started off, was this idea of faith encounter, where you began as a sort of psychologist who what we think of as like sort of classic, agnostic,
Yeah.
atheistic, and had an encounter. And so this book, gave you a place to really talk about that in a way that maybe you weren't always free to do within the context of academia or research. What was it like to be a psychologist when you had this own faith journey? Like, what was that like for you with colleagues and students and that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's interesting. It was only relatively recently that we could talk about spiritual things, talk about aspects such as love or God. Back then, this was back in the 70s, 80s, as researchers, as academics, we weren't really allowed to talk about spiritual things, because how could you measure that? And so you had to be quiet about your faith if you had it. In fact, psychology as a field has the lowest level of prevalence of faith-related people, and so this my coming to God, shall we say, happened as a result of breakdowns in my life, a divorce, brokenhearted times, going through depression. This was sort of earlier in my career, and so it got to a place that was so painful. And by the way, my attempts to kind of quell the riot, if you will, and to help my trauma that was triggered by all this. I tried drinking. I tried being addicted to running. I did marathons. Nothing seemed to help. And I finally got to a place, and by the way, after going through AA, and in fact, that was my first church. It was a place where there was unconditional love. You could tell people anything and they'd still love you. I thought that's a pretty amazing thing. But I got to a point where I just cried out to God. I didn't know God. In fact, I didn't even think Jesus existed. And I just cried out and said, I need to know if you're there now. And there was this powerful, transformative, radical blast into me, which, by the way, I thought I had had a psychotic break. I thought, wow, I must have gone crazy. And if I ever come back to that reality, I'll have to tell my students and my colleagues about what it was like to experience that. Well, by the way, I have yet to come back to that reality. One of those things where you get transformed. And so then it was a matter of, now what? What do I do with that? Do I leave psychology? Because I can no longer worship at the altar of science, of non-God science. And it's like there was a new altar for me. And I struggled with how to integrate it. And I talk about it in the book of, boy, what do I do now? How can I put them together? But I managed to, with maybe a lot of help. And that was a time where I had some faith-oriented colleagues who encouraged me. And we ended up doing at the major behavior therapy association. We did a symposium. I put on the program because I was the program director at that time, and it was called Integrating Spiritual and Behavioral Approaches to Change. Say what? It was like
never been done before.
Never done before. So I was warned by colleagues, this is going to ruin your career. And I thought, well, great. I'm going to go out in flames. That could have made my choice easier of how to accommodate those two parts of my life. And wouldn't you know, you wouldn't know, there was a standing room only. It was packed. It was like all of these folks like us, maybe, came out of the woodwork, that we get to talk about this now. We get to integrate or talk about our faith with our psychology practice. And so that led to an edited book that I did with my colleague and friend, Bill Miller. And then it was sort of off to the races. How do we put this together? And it led to a number of other things of me trying to integrate my faith. At one point, in deciding to stay in psychology, I decided to go to the church, especially the African American church, where there were lots of health issues, especially cancer and heart disease and obesity. And I made sort of approaches to the churches who welcomed me there. And I brought in research assistants, and actually had a large NIH grant where we worked on high blood pressure with people.
And there's a story there. I don't know. Can we get into
Yeah,
the
yeah.
blood pressure story? That's one of my favorites.
This was part of the kind of the goofy, sometimes stupid professor learning about how to interact with the community, how to do community-based research. So I was told by colleagues, oh, you need to talk with the Ministerial Alliance if you're interested in minority communities in health things. And I said, oh, well, what's that? And they said, well, it's the pastors from the Black and the Hispanic communities, particularly, and priests who gather together, and they control the community. And if you're going to get any kind of work done, you got to get their support. So I made an appointment, and at some point, I think I had to wait a couple of months, and then they said, okay, you can now come talk with us. Well, I get there, and no sooner was I there than they let me have it. I'm the white professor from up on high, the ivory towers. By the way, they let me know all the other professors who had come down to use their community for their research, and then they would disappear, and the community would be no better for it.
Yeah.
And so, it probably was 30 minutes of letting me have it. And by the way, they brought up the Tuskegee experiment,
of course,
where most of us know about that, where the Black community, which was not far from there, where I was a professor, and they and it was like I put my feet to the fire, shall we say, over that terrible example of research before we had ethics committees in which all of these Black men who had syphilis were followed but not treated when they had what looked like a pretty good treatment. They just wanted to know what happens in the brain and to the person if we don't treat them. Unbelievable, unconscionable.
That was
right?
Tuskegee.
That was Tuskegee.
Yeah.
And so, boy, I'm sweating bullets. And at the end, I just thought, I might even said a prayer at that point. I probably did. What do I do now? And so humor came over me kind of in a desperate way. And I said, by the way, I wanted their support for a high blood pressure study I wanted to do with the community. And I said to them, does anyone have a blood pressure cuff? I think my blood pressure has gone way up. And it broke the ice. They laughed, that belly laugh that you hear people do. And so I started to laugh. And that was a point where they thought, this guy's all right.
Wow.
And so they gave me their full support. I went into the Jackie Robinson YMCA. I went into a kind of a spirit-filled, mostly African-American church, and turned my research to work in those areas a lot.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's moments like that where you realize, yes, I can have all the psychology knowledge in the world, but like I need to relate to you as a person, right? That's what's the most important thing right now. And I think that your stories really point to that, really point us to that, is that ultimately we have to relate to each other as people. And that's what the stories really help us to do.
And there's a connection there with Africa.
Yes.
Sometimes when we become believers in God, right? We become faith followers. We make deals with God. And I did. I said, well, I'll do anything. I'll follow you, God, and but not to Africa. I'm not going to go to Africa.
We know where this is going.
And there's a phrase that I think in the Bible, but a lot of us know it. And it says, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. So God laughed all the way to getting me to Africa. I've made, I think, 9 trips to Africa.
Wow.
Both as a researcher, as a professor, as a teacher. I had 2 sabbaticals over there, South Africa in particular, and also as sometimes as for mission work, to go over and help with the poor in areas. And I also was appointed to be on the first U.S. team to help South Africa with their AIDS crisis.
Wow.
And that was an NIH project in which the South African military came over to the US and said, can you help us? Because our health minister and president in South Africa are blocking our attempts to bring treatment into all of the people that were losing to AIDS deaths.
Wow.
So the U.S. NIH sent over a team. I was on the first team as the first behavioral scientist, and I got to do training of doctors, nurses, pastors, AIDS counselors, and all that, in how to help them with their medication compliance, with lifestyle change, some pretty difficult things. And so I got to travel on that project and some others around Southern Africa in particular to do training, for example, of nurses. One project was with nurses who counsel pregnant women who are HIV positive. And we knew at that time that the virus could be transferred through a mother's milk. And so they had to counsel these women there. So I got to go to places like Namibia and Swaziland, and to do training of nurses and sometimes physicians. And I remember one of my first occasions in which I'm training the nurses. I'm like an American. I'm talking and reaching out, trying to talk with them about things they're going to have to learn of how to do it. And I noticed they didn't talk much. Mostly these were, they called nurse sisters. They weren't necessarily nuns. They were just nurses. And so I noticed they didn't talk much. And so I would go on. I'd wait my typical American hesitation of maybe 5 seconds, and then I move on.
Like maybe 2 seconds. Yeah.
Maybe 5 seconds. And finally, the physicians who were on the team, who were more South African, they pulled me aside one night and said, you got to shut up. I said, what? They said, this is a different culture. You can't treat these folks like they're Americans and they're going to have quick responses, interactions. You need to give them time to process and to think. And so the next day I did my own cognitive therapy, and I would say something and ask a question, and then I would stop and wait. And it seemed like an eternity, but I would do this dialogue of, okay, John, shut up, don't talk. They're listening, they're processing, they're thinking. It was like an age. And finally, sometimes even a minute later, you can imagine that, I would just wait on them, and then they would respond. And there was the most wonderful, rich, beautiful processing and thoughtfulness and caring that I would hear from them. It changed the way I learned to talk with Africans. Very different than what we do here in the U.S. And by the way, one of my trainings over in Swaziland, which when I entered the country, I was told it's the only country in the world that has a Christian constitution, and their king was a Christian, and basically that was for the whole country. And I thought, isn't that curious? So I asked them at the border, I said, well, will I get to meet the king? And I was kidding. And they said, well, maybe you could see him. He's around.
Oh my gosh.
But these nurses apparently fell in love with me. And I fell in love with these African there. And it was just coming up on the King's Parade of the Virgins, where once a year, the king would pick a new virgin to make as his next wife. And they said, look, we want to get you married off to one of the Parade of Virgins. I thought, what? I laughed. I said, well, no, those are the king's virgins. And they said, oh, no, he only picks one. You'd have your pick of all the rest. And so I said, thank you so much. Maybe not this trip.
That's amazing. Yeah. So you guys, if y'all are here with us and you're enjoying the stories, grab a copy today, paperaphanbooks.com/psychology confidential. You can get a free copy, dive into it this weekend. If you know anyone who could use a few good laughs, maybe wants to know a little bit more psychology, this is a great book for them. And one thing I kind of want to land on is that it's not all like serious stories, right? I mean, most of your stories have kind of a tongue in cheek or self-deprecating or just funny kind of punchline, but some of the topics even are a little bit like, really, Dr. John, we're going to talk about animal psychology? When you first told me about the animal psychology section that you wanted to include, I was like, is that necessary? But
Does it fit?
actually, yeah, I was like, that seems a little out there. But you pulled me around. You're like, no, Morgan, this is, this is something that we really want to broaden people's kind of ideas around. So, okay, animal psychology. Why? What are some of the stories? What's a story in animal psychology that you feel like
Well,
could change someone's mind about how it's important?
you bet. Well, where would psychology as a field be without animal experiments?
Mhm.
We've learned so much about animal behavior and how to modify it, how to understand it through our work with animals, in particular, dogs, but in some cases, cats. Um, I like poking some fun at my old colleagues way back in the field. For example, Pavlov.
Yeah.
Now, Pavlov, most people understand that he did these experiments with these drooling dogs,
Yep.
and they he conditioned these dogs to salivate, to drool,
Yep.
at the sound of a bell, which had been conditioned because of its association with food powder being inserted into his mouth. But what I tell him is, you probably don't know this, but Pavlov was originally a cat person. He didn't much like dogs. They didn't much care for him. And so, but the cats would have no part of this food powder insertion device being too smart, so they'd run off, but the dogs were okay with it. So he reluctantly switched and did the dogs, and the rest is history. We also know that there have been other famous experiments with dogs in particular, that I talk about. And in some cases, I poke some fun at my colleagues in the field. But also, we have the family animal farm, you might say, that I learned a lot from my various dogs, and some cats. And so I talk about some of those stories in the book that I think mostly are humorous, and as well as talking about Barnabas, my service dog.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So what's a cat? You've talked about the dogs. What about a cat story?
Yep.
We gotta even this out.
We got to even it out. And cats are great. They're smart, too smart for me and probably for us. They won't put up with the experiments, even though there have been a history of experiments with cats. But some of the cats I had this cat called a Manx, and he was big. He looked like a wild cat, and he was all gray and white. I called him Gandalf because he looked like a Gandalf from Lord of the Rings, and he was such an interesting cat. I watched him. We lived on a boat together for several years after my divorce, and he used to watch the ducks come up to the boat. Oh, he thought that might be good to eat, you know. And next thing I know, I hear a splash. He has jumped in on top of a duck, but you see, nobody told him that ducks can swim and dive,
Oh no.
and he couldn't. So he got back to the boat. I think he might have danced across the water, somehow got back to the boat. He never tried that again. But one day he thought a big blue heron on a dock we were docked at might be good to eat. And so he at one point ran to capture this heron. It was huge. The heron just flapped his wings a couple times, pecked him on the head, and he ran off. Gandalf decided no, he wasn't going to do that anymore. But Gandalf had some dogness. He taught me that he could fetch. I would throw a piece of paper across the boat. He would run, get it, bring it back up, give it to me for more attempts at that. So he was a great cat. So really enjoyed him, and have had my parents had Siamese. I had another cat that used to harass my first black lab, and would do things like bring birds in order to play with them and eat them. That's what cats do. And yet this lab, his training was to capture birds in a soft mouth and let them go. And so they would play this game. Cat would bring in the birds. He would grab the bird, let it outside.
Oh no.
But one day the cat, this cat would harass him, maybe by batting him on the muzzle or something, and running into the bathroom. And we figured this out one day when we came home and we heard this whining of the dog locked in the bathroom. We thought, how did the dog get locked in the bathroom? So we figured it out. The cat would run in there with him in hot pursuit, get in between the crook between the door and the wall. Then it would slip out as the dog pushed his way into the corner and shut the door. And they continued that in some pretty wild ways. So we learned a lot from our animals and from that behavior.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, once you start thinking about human cognitive behavior and behavior change and things like that, you kind of start to see those patterns in animals
Yeah,
too, and they can kind of reflect it back to us. That's fun.
you
So
bet.
you guys, you get everything from PTSD
Yep.
and faith journeys and African research and community trips and animals, and it's all with a lighthearted kind of tongue-in-cheek
Yep.
sense of humor.
But
So
not to neglect my ill-fated attempts at being a dad. So being dad psychologist.
parenting too. Yep.
Oh, parenting too. There was the occasion when my son, who's maybe about 3, and we're shopping, and I was shopping for food for the family, but he was shopping for cookies.
Yes.
And so, you know how quick a 3-year-old can be. So he had grabbed the cookie package before I could intercept him. I put it back. By the way, that's not a good thing to do, to try to take away something from your 3-year-old. Well, the hierarchy started. This is something that we know is a type of severe nag. And he starts the whimpering, the crying. It then went to sort of yelling. And we get to the front of the line. And he didn't realize at the time, my dad's a psychologist. He knows the narrative. And so I thought, do not reinforce this behavior ever. And so he's there, we're in the line, he's now screeching, screaming.
Yep.
You know, the sort of the Three Stooge like thing where they throw themselves on the ground and they run around on the floor.
Oh yeah.
And I looked around, and shall we say, the faces of all the people in the supermarket, almost all who could hear his screaming, were not happy at old dad here. And it was sort of a give him the damn cookie. But the checker at the supermarket line, she was a dad lady, and she looked at me and she gave me the dad kind of fist pull. You go, dad power. It was so good. And this whole episode probably was, I don't know, might have been 45 seconds, which was an age in supermarket time. And I finally looked down at him. I said, are you done? And he stopped crying, got up, and we walked out. It was like this victory. But you know, my sister, Jane, who actually got cancer, and we lost her at a young age. And when she was in the hospital, I actually, as a graduate student who had just had a hypnosis course, she begged me to hypnotize her. And I knew that I wasn't supposed to do that for family members, but I thought, hey, she's my sister and I love her. And so I ended up hypnotizing her and teaching her how to do it for herself, because some of the procedures she had to go through were really painful and scary. And it was just one of those heartfelt things. And I talk about that story in the book. But I also talk about how my sister was a brilliant nag. So I learned a lot about nagging, and nagging is something we call negative reinforcement. I talk about that in the book, but no matter there. And so here's an illustration of her sort of her brilliant nagging that can work. So one night she's about to go to bed with her husband, and she says, have you taken the garbage out yet? And he said, no. So he goes to sleep. So she sets the alarm for 2 a.m. And then alarm goes off. She wakes him and says, did you take the garbage out yet? And he said, no. He goes back to sleep. She sets it for 3 a.m. Wakes him again. Have you yet taken the garbage out? I think this went on till about maybe 5 a.m. Finally, he jumps up. He's angry. He stomps down. He takes the bags of garbage. He throws them in the garbage can. He stomps back up and goes to bed. She turns the alarm off. So that was this brilliant
And
nag.
probably never has to ask again.
Never had to ask again. And so I talk about nagging and how it works and why does it work and how do we deal with it when someone has learned that nagging works.
Mm.
So I talk in some of those instances about that, and I talk a lot about my attempts at parenting as a psychologist, which mostly were funny. But as I said, that there are stories in the middle of the book, mostly about trauma, about working with veterans, and about what happened to me when God got a hold of me.
Yeah. Yeah. So many good stories packed in here. You guys are going to have to get your own copy. paperravenbooks.com/psychology confidential. You can grab a free copy today. So go ahead and do that here and now while you are thinking about it. And I have kind of one more question for you, Dr. John. And
Sure.
you gave us a little bit of insight into your transition from being a professor and a researcher and a teacher into this new career, basically as a
Yeah.
writer.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that process was like to become really a writer and now an author? And then I'll ask you a little bit about your lesson learned, what you feel like is
Sure.
your major lesson learned. But yeah, walk us through your
Yeah.
transition into being a writer and an author.
Well, it was actually a difficult one, because there's two parts of kind of a behavior or a future. One is the decision to do it, and the other is how to do it. So I finally made the decision, I need to write. I got to write. I think it's important to do, even for me. And then came well, how do I do it? And my sort of ill-fated attempts to sit down and start writing, I would find all kinds of ways to avoid writing. It was painful. And so finally I decided to use a technique that I had used that helped me get my doctorate. And it was, I call it the contract. And what it was a contract in which I laid out the behaviors I had to do. And if I didn't, I would self-punish. I would punish myself if I didn't comply. Now we know in psychology that's not the best sort of contract. You should have reinforcement for positive behavior more so, and maybe some punishment blended in for lack of compliance. And I found a buddy of mine who was in the doctoral program with me. His name was Murray, and he was going to invoke the penalty if I didn't comply with writing up my dissertation, which I was required to do, and basically was told by my mentor, who was going to leave at the end of the year, and he wasn't coming back. This is a scary thing for a senior doctoral student, to lose your mentor and to have to start over all again. And so I needed to find someone who was a friend enough, but just mean enough to invoke the penalty, because I wasn't going to invoke the penalty, but I needed someone to do that. And so what I put in the contract was that I had to come up, say, every 2 weeks with 20 plus pages of written of the dissertation typed out. And if I didn't produce it, then Murray would take the addressed envelope with a check written to one of my most hated organizations.
Oh, no.
And by the way, with a letter in there that said, I support everything you stand for. I want to be listed as a lifetime supporter and donor. And the three organizations, I was going to school in the South at that time, were the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, the American Nazi Party.
Oh, no.
And this, I sort of poke fun at my colleagues in psychiatry, the American Psychiatric Association. So anyway,
you really don't want to be listed as the lifetime donor and supporter of.
So the night before, I called Murray. I hadn't typed a word. I had writer's block. I was frozen in fear. I called him. I said, Murray, I need a little more time to do that. And you know how people laugh with that kind of evil cackle laugh? And he did. And he said, here's the mailbox I'm going to be stationed at 12 noon tomorrow. And if I don't see that 20-page document, that letter is going in the mailbox. And so I freaked out. I typed all night and I made the contract. And then the next two I made I didn't have to pay or be on those lifetime rolls for those organizations. Okay, so I thought, you know what? I'm not writing. I need to write this book. I'm going to use the contract. And so I got a friend of mine who was, again, friend enough, but just mean enough to invoke the punishment. And I wrote out the contract. And I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to tell the reader which were the three most hated organizations. They were much more modern iterations of that, maybe. And I was all ready to do it when he and his wife contacted me and said they just weren't keen on the idea that I should write because I wanted to, because I had a passion for the writing. And so I was a little upset with him, but he was right. And then I began reading books about how to write quickly. And yours was one of the books that I fortunately, I got on your email blast. And finally, when you came up with the new pilot program for, shall we say, special needs author like myself, I signed up. And here we are at the finish line a little over a year later. And I'm so blessed to have been sitting now on a book that needed to be written. And we'll see what happens. I hope that a lot of people will read it and hopefully buy it. And so I became a writer. I still keep my private practice. I have about one day a week in which I work with individuals and families and veterans with PTSD. So that's a real blessing. But generally, I'm a writer. I've got a couple more books in mind. We'll see how it goes with this one. But that was sort of the process, and I'm so excited to see how this book does.
Yeah, me too. It's been such an honor to walk this journey with you. I mean, I know there were seasons where it was, there was a lot of writing, and then no, we've got to kind of pare it down, and then there's a lot of decision making when you're including, even when you're trying to be selective in the stories and why this story and all that. It's still, it's a lifetime to think through. And so I know that I could certainly see you transform as a writer and not in the typical academic way, but now in the really having a relationship with the reader kind of way.
It's a very different kind of writing. And as you know, I break away throughout the book with something I call "Can We Talk?" After Joan Rivers' funny effort to talk directly to the audience. And so I have a number of those sort of kind of sprinkled throughout, where I talk more intimately directly to the reader, to tell the reader what makes sense, what doesn't, what's stupid, what's funny, maybe some things that there might be worth learning about. And so that's a part of that. And it's a different kind of writing. It's a very different kind of writing.
Yeah. Can you tell us about who you were modeling after?
Oh, this is great. Well, my brother is a non-reader. He's one of these, I talk about him in the book. He's one who sort of dropped out of school because it wasn't for him. And he basically decided that he just wanted to work in the aircraft industry. And he sort of focused in on a large aircraft manufacturer, a jet maker. And he went in and said, "I'll do whatever you want. I want to work here." He worked his way up from figuratively a floor sweeper. Now he's in charge of the whole engineering program in which they fix all the jet engines.
Wow.
And he's done quality control and all that. Well, anyway, I talked with him about this book idea. And I said, but I'd like him to be one of my readers. How would I get him to read this sort of a book? Obviously not a dry book about psychology and all that, but a more fun-loving kind of book. And he along with my dad and me were real fans of Dave Barry. And for those people who know Dave Barry, he's this wild and crazy, outrageous writer who makes fun of everybody. And so David told me, if it looked like a book written by Dave Barry, I'd read it. And that stuck. It was, so I want to make it more fun and hilarious, while also telling serious stories that maybe the reader could learn some things in terms of the things I've learned in my field. And so So I thought, okay. And so I copied some of Dave Barry's techniques, like all caps, making fun of myself and everyone I possibly can make fun of.
Yep.
By the way, including Dr. Phil and Dr. Laura. So I don't know how they're going to like it, but I'm hoping to get them a copy somehow. Anyway, I just got a text from him because he's had the print copy of it for a few weeks. Amazingly, he said he's read most of it and he really loves it. So bingo. So now I got to get Dave Barry a copy.
That's right. That's the next mission. So if you like Dave Barry, you're gonna like these stories. Yeah. That's it. Okay, so Dr. John, you have walked through this whole journey, which, with us has been a year, but really has been even longer than that.
Yes.
You've probably been thinking about this book for a while, and now we're, as you said, we're kind of at the finish line. The book is launching. It's real. You can hold it in your hands. It's here. Looking back to
it's a miracle.
Looking back at that younger version of yourself, maybe it was a couple of years ago when you were thinking about the book, but didn't have this sort of wealth of experience that you do now. Is there anything that you wish you'd known back then? Anything that you would tell kind of a younger version of yourself about writing a book?
Boy, first, find a great publishing editing company like yours, like Paper Raven Books. Find that sooner. When you know you can't do it, find folks, professionals, hopefully, that can help you do it, who know how to do it, who know how to guide an author and craft the book in the way that it should be. But in some cases, I had to experience a lot of these things before I could write, because some of them were fairly current. And I also think that that some of the things I couldn't write until I was at the other end of the academic career. I think that I would have paid more attention to different kinds of writing. I think what I learned from reading about people who are writers, how they learn to write, is they wrote a lot. Yeah. They wrote in journals. They were writing and practicing it and crafting their ability to write on their own. And I think I would have done that sooner. And I think I would have kept more journals. To go back and, fact check, if you will, but also get ideas. But when we had the smartphones, I used to have notes written in little pieces of paper, and who knows where they are. Oh, here's a story, or a joke. Yep. And now with the smartphones, I have these long files of notes of stories that I should remember to tell. And I think that was very helpful on that. And just to be thinking about the kinds of writing that I might do, that how I could share with other people, and also to realize that I'm a storyteller, and my teaching style was to tell stories or to give examples or case studies, and this was a way in which I could put that in a book, and I could write the book as if I was talking, as if I was giving a fun presentation to people. By the way, one of the things that helped a lot is I had all these old pictures, and people who get the book, and hopefully they'll not only buy the book, but they will get the Kindle or the version, the ebook, in which they see the color pictures. I have sprinkled pictures throughout the book. Some of them crazy and funny, some of them real touching, like my sister Jane, who had died of cancer. Some of my dad, who was the madman advertising exec from Madison Avenue. I've had people tell me they loved the pictures, not just the cover picture of the crazy professor, but I think that I encourage the readers, even if they get the book that has the pictures but in black and white, that they'll get onto the website, Psychology Confidential, thebook.com. And we'll have a listing of the pictures that they can look and see. And by the way, I'm just now about partway through the audio book. I am narrating it. So if they hated my voice, they'll not like that. But if my voice is okay, and they can be basically listening to me give a lecture about my life in psychology, my crazy life in psychology, they might really like the audiobook too.
I think so. I think so. So y'all go ahead and grab the ebook version, which you can get at paperhavenbooks.com/psychology confidential, and know that the audio version is coming out shortly. So y'all stay tuned for that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Dr. John. Thank you for writing this book. I mean, it takes not a small amount of courage to come out and tell stories about your own life. It's a little bit of a vulnerable feeling, and you're talking about academia and faith and your own missteps and mistakes and things you wish you'd done differently and things you wish
Amen.
you'd known, and you really sort of open up in this book. And so thank you for taking the plunge and for writing this book. I know it will change perspectives, change minds, change hearts,
Yeah.
change lives. So
Yeah. Thank you, Morgan, so much. It's been such a pleasure working with you and your amazing team. And let's see what happens. I hope that a lot of people will pick it up and read it, even though it's a little bit long. But I think it's written in a way where you won't get too bored. I think it moves along pretty quickly. And by the way, if my brother likes it, who's not a reader, maybe just about anybody could like it.
Yep. I think so. All right, y'all grab your copy, paperhavenbooks.com/psychology confidential. Dr. John, thanks for being here, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.